With women of color, one of the biggest issues in society is the fetishization of women of color. There's this continuous idea that women of color need to live up to certain standards that are not only approved by the male gaze, but also approved by white people. And so we could see this with porn and the categories of porn, the stereotypes of Latina women, their bodies, their attitudes, Arab women, Asian women who are supposed to be submissive.
Officials say the woman who was so brutally beaten in that video has just been released from the hospital after recovering there in stable condition. Now, the New York City Hate Crimes Task Force is now investigating the incident, and there has been no arrest of the suspect yet.
So we see that when women of color do not follow these categories or these stereotypes, a lot of the times they are harmed and they are sexually abused. And not only if they don't follow that, if they do follow these stereotypes or these categories, we see that men are trying to take advantage of that. They like to prey on women of color because of the idea of submissiveness. They like the idea that women of color have so much struggle, that they are the perfect housewife, or that they are ready to worship their husband, or you provide them with sexual activities that can not be achieved with any other person. These stereotypes, not only do they objectify women and they're very harmful for women, but it also gets to a point where you're dehumanizing a person and every aspect of their identity just so they could be approved by men. And that's why sexual abuse and sexual harassment and rape really impacts these women, because if this is all when we see a Black woman, we think of her ass, or when we see an Arab woman, we think of her being submissive, or the petite Asian, quiet woman, we are basically stripping them down from their identities just so we can put up this objectification cover for men.
A 16-year-old girl was allegedly raped by 400 people. That's right, 400 people in the last 6 months in Beed district. She was also allegedly sexually exploited by a policeman when she tried to file a complaint. The crime has triggered massive outrage across Maharashtra.
This type of fetishes are also seen in porn, where porn is a very harmful industry for women of color, where they are human trafficked, they are categorized, they are dehumanized, and it kind of rots the brain of an individual, because then you only start to see women of color as the sexual preference that you have, rather than being human and being in front of you and having struggles with both of their identities. When women of color are assaulted or raped and they want to come forward and they want to get some kind of support from the government or from society or even from individuals in their lives, these stereotypes that are pinned on these women, it allows for them to hesitate to come forward and speak out. A lot of women come from cultures where there's a shame that is tied around being raped or being a victim of this kind of abuse, which is why a lot of women of color feel like from their culture and from the background that they're from, that they can't come forward. A lot of government-assisted programs that help these women and help these victims, they don't usually prioritize women of color, and this can be seen through all types of programs, not just for sexual abuse. And the system is made to help white people, it's made to help men, it's made to help everybody but women of color. And that is why sometimes they feel like it's hopeless and they don't feel like they can be helped, which is even more straining for their mental health and for their physical health and sexual health. Immigrant women they tend to be forgotten and swept under the rug. And the issue with this is that when immigrant women come into countries like Canada and the US and even some European countries looking for a better life, they are handed with a bunch of employment discriminatory policies that these women coming from different countries, their education or their work experience might not be approved. This leads into a slippery slope that we have built in Canada and in the US, where women of color then find themselves having to appeal to that fetishization that is present in these countries to try and make some money. This can be through human trafficking, prostitution, sex work, and when there's no support for these women, it also makes them way more prone to sexual abuse and rape than any other group of people in our societies.
6 شهور بقيت هنيكا كل يوم إهانة واغتصاب والدرب كل يوم حاولت أكثر من مرة أن أنتحر ولكن كل مرة كنت أفشل.
There are these practices that are common for women of color, and that may be modesty, and we can see this with the hijab for Muslim women, certain kinds of like traditional dress clothes, a part of cultures. We could see that African American culture and Latino culture is very prevalent, and the clothes that they might wear might seem sexualized. It's almost like we won't allow women of color to wear what they want or to practice the ideas that they want without consequences because it does not fit into those like constricted Western categories. Women of color have faced lots of generational trauma, and it's not very uncommon to see that there's a lot of behaviors and trauma responses that women of color will act out on because of the generational traumas that they faced. Colonialism and imperialism have allowed for Western soldiers to come into our countries, invade countries that women of color are present in, and abuse them, sexualize them, rape them, torture them, kidnap them, and sell them. And although women of color might not be direct victims of these acts will traumatize a woman, and when she has birth and has kids, she will pass that trauma down onto them. And so we see here that women of color are victims of sexual abuse and sexual trauma, whether they've faced anything or not. The behaviors of these victims are passed down so subtly that it's not obvious to any person at first, but it is something we need to acknowledge. It is something we need to know. We need to acknowledge all of these ideas that I've just mentioned before, because it shows us that it is not just the direct harm that women face, but the fact that the system and history and people's ideas view women of color as objects, and it creates a very harmful environment for women who live in Western countries.